I think just like the other two speakers, I'd like to begin by thanking the Keynes Fund for supporting our research. This is really the first part of this project on learning, social learning, and fake news. And this is an experimental project, and it just turned out with COVID, it was very difficult to run experiments. We tried to run them online, and then finally we went back to the lab, but it took us a while to get back into the lab. So, but I'm very pleased to present this. We are very excited about the results, and I should start by saying this is joint work with Sing-Yu Choi at Seoul National University, Fred Mosson, who's at Lyon, a business school at Lyon, and Tony To, who's a PhD student at Cambridge. And the idea for this project really is trying to understand peer effects. And in particular, we want to kind of take seriously the idea that a number of researchers have uncovered over the last 50 years or so, that peer effects tend to, so somehow there are two features of who we talk to, which are very distinctive. One, we tend to, in many communities, we tend to have hubs or influencers or celebrities, which are very prominent in the social space. And the other feature of social networks is homophily. So the idea that men are mostly friends with other men, or academics are friends with other academics. Women are generally friends with other women, and so on. So there's this sort of tendency to pick friends. Not the proportion of male friends I have is not half; it's much higher than half. Or so somehow it's not representing the proportion of men in the population. So we want to take seriously these two ideas, and we want to ask, if you sprinkle some information, unbiased information in social networks, which are like empirically observed social networks, then how's this information? People communicate, they talk to each other, they watch, they observe what their peers are doing. And we want to understand how they influence each other. Okay, so at the sort of fundamental level, there's a sort of intuition here that if there's a large number of people and they are all getting fairly independent pieces of information, then there is something that we are all familiar with, and it's known as the strong law of large numbers. There is some sense in which there would be wisdom of crowds. Okay, if you just put together this information, you would get something corresponding to wisdom. So you would know the truth. Now, the key thing that's happening in social networks is not everyone's piece of information is going to get equal salience, because if you're all looking at Tokyo and not looking at each other, his information, let's say, is as accurate or as inaccurate or as noisy as everyone else, but his information will then have much more influence than, let's say, my information or Matt's information, because nobody's looking at us. So that's the very simple high-level idea that we want to think about when we think about deep inequalities in networks. The other idea we want to think about is, if I'm hanging out with Toke and Matt all the time, there are three men hanging out and we have some views about the world, and I don't really see or talk to or follow the other half of the population, then Toke, Matt, and I could persist in erroneous beliefs, or strange ideas, because we don't actually listen enough. This is sometimes referred to as echo chambers. And that could lead to us holding these views maybe for a very long time, okay? Because we just keep talking to each other. And every time I come and tell Toke and Matt, hey, this is not the way the world is, they say, don't be silly. And of course, I hang out with them all the time. So of course, I say, yeah, of course, they're right. Okay. So that's the second idea, high-level idea we want to think about. Okay, so there's quite a large theoretical literature on thinking about communication and uh, how networks are going to shape aggregation of information. And so we're going to take that theory and we're going to essentially, the theory actually has pretty strong predictions. It is sort of in line with your first sort of intuition you might have, that when you have influencers and hubs, they can drive a community off into completely false beliefs. Okay, that's one theorem. That's sort of a meta theorem in this literature. The other sort of meta theorem in this literature is that when you have homophilous populations, there could be disagreement which could persist for long periods of time about matters of fact. Okay, so if I, for instance, believe that most pharmaceutical firms and most doctors are in league and they're all trying to make money when the vaccine comes along, I might just actually keep talking to other folks who are like that. Or I might have views that there are long-term effects of vaccines, and many of my people around have the same sort of idea, and that might persist. Okay, so there are sort of fairly deep mathematical results that have been worked over the last 20, 25 years, which show that these intuitions are actually quite robust. Okay, so what we're going to do in this paper is essentially take these meta theorems and to the lab and ask whether indeed this is what happens when human subjects are faced with these sorts of environments. Okay. So given that this is a 20-minute talk, let me just say that this has been one of the more exciting and interesting fields of research in economics, in economic theory, but also in experiments and over the past 30 years or so. So it's a very large literature in this space. Okay, so I won't have time to talk about it, but just to flag that this is very widely studied, and not just by economists, but also, of course, by folks in computer science and sociology and political science. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a sort of a very tractable, very simple model, and we are going to use the predictions of this model to inform our hypotheses. So this is a model where there are two states of the world, A and B, and I'm going to get a payoff of 1 if I choose the correct state. I'm going to get a payoff of 0 if I choose the wrong state. I get a signal on the true state, and this is informative, but it's noisy. And everybody gets an independent and equally informative, equally noisy signal about the true state. Okay, so it's a very, very simple environment. And we get the signal and we choose an action. And of course, normally one would expect that action to match the signal one gets because it's informative. So the communication and learning kicks in after period 1. So period 2 onwards, you can observe the actions of your neighbors. So I turn to Took and I see, well, he chose A in period 1. So I say, oh, he must have got a signal, he must have got a signal in favor of state A. And I look at Matt and he's got a signal in favor of B. So I say, well, he must have got a signal in favor of state B. So that gives me some information, or maybe they both choose A. That tells me maybe A is more likely. Okay, and then period 3, I see that my action, of course, I realize my action in period 2 was informed by their signals, but in period 3, I can now ask, maybe their actions in period 2 were informed by the signals of their neighbors. Okay, so that's how information could, in principle, spread or percolate through these connections. Okay, so that's the problem we are studying. And we're going to look at 3 networks. The first one is the Airdraining Network, which is, many of you have probably heard about it. This is the classical sort of model where every link is equally likely. So it's fairly homogeneous. Most people are going to have links close to the average number of links. Then I'm going to have a Homophilus network, which you can see there are 8 communities in this network in the middle. And you see that these communities are more densely connected than across, the connections across. Okay. And finally, I have a community that I refer to as a royal family, We introduced this network in an early paper in the late 90s. I was visiting England and we were following the Prince Charles, Lady Diana affair. And so, everyone was just talking about that. So this is a network where there are three royal family members who are really, everyone's looking at them. They don't really care about the world at large. They're mostly self-absorbed. And so what happens is, if it's probably hard to see here in this picture, but everyone here is looking at these three people in common and has one other friend in the rest of the population. Okay, so this is the world where everyone's got some local connections, local peers, but they are highly influenced by a few celebrities. Okay. So these are the three networks we're going to look at. And let me just, so what does the de Groot model tell us? The de Groot model says, it's a theoretical model proposed by Maurice de Groot, who's a statistician. It says that when I don't know what's going on, I just look at the average in my neighborhood amongst my peers, and I just follow the average of my neighborhood. Okay, so that's how I make my choices. So we're going to look at opinion dynamics, and we're going to define a group level statistic, CT, which measures the proximity to the truth or falsehood relative to the initial assignment of signals. So if 70% of the signals are true, then the initial assignment in a large population, 70% of the signals will be correct signals, okay? And so then you're going to start with N0, that's the number of correct signals at 70%. So learning only happens, when everyone does the right thing. So then N is equal to, everyone chooses N. So that's the maximum amount of learning you can have. And NT is the actual learning you have, okay? So that gives you the ratio of learning relative to what you could have had. So what does the de Groot model predict in these three networks? It predicts something actually quite striking. In the Airdraining network, it essentially says that the CT parameter is pretty close to 100%, for most of the runs. This is 1,000 runs. In the royal family, it's quite strikingly different. 80% of the runs, everyone does the correct action, and 20% of the runs, everyone does the wrong action. Okay, so that almost never happens in the Airdraining. Okay, that's because of these influencers, the royal family, who can drive the whole community in the wrong direction. And finally, we look at the Homophilus network, and here you see that you get a lot of breakdown in consensus. Okay, there is only 30% consensus. 30% of the runs, so 300 runs, you get consensus, but a majority of the time you actually don't get consensus. Okay, this is reflecting the theorem that you have persistence of different beliefs, okay, for a long time. And this is actually the long run outcome. Okay, so it's not as though they're moving around. Okay, so we're going to test three hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that individual guesses converge. So they're not bouncing around forever. They just, over time, they settle down. The second hypothesis is, well, what do they settle down on? The second hypothesis is that you have breakdown of consensus in stochastic block model, which is the Homophilus model. And the third one is that you get more correct and more incorrect consensus under the royal family. Okay, people converge quickly, but they also converge quickly to the wrong consensus. And how am I doing for time, Topi?
Well, you got about max 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the experiment we ran had everyone was shown, could take a ball out of a bag, and the bag would have 7 red and 3 green, or 7 green and 3 red balls. So when it had a majority of red balls, we referred to it as a red bag, and otherwise we call it a green bag. So every subject draws a ball and sees the color of the ball. And so you can see that when you get a red ball, it's more likely you've got a red bag. Okay? So it's in that sense that a signal is informative, but it's noisy. You could get the red ball even though it's a green bag. Okay, so we're going to run this 12 periods and all. I mean, so they draw the signals and then they repeatedly choose. They look at the signal, then they look at this, peers, and they look repeatedly at the same peers. Okay, and as I said, you get positive payoffs if your guess matches the true color of the bag. Okay, so we're going to have, I'm only going to talk about the 40 subjects experiment today. So as I said, there are 3 networks. There's a typo here, one network we've taken out of the presentation. There are 4 groups of players for each network. So there are 12 groups in all, and each group plays this, 6 times, and each time you play 12 periods. We ran this experiment in Valencia, in this lab, which is very well known. Many of you probably used it yourself. Okay, this is the decision screen. So the subject is me in yellow, and she sees, she has 4 neighbors, and she sees the color green or red they chose in the previous period. She can go up and actually click on previous periods and figure out what their choices were. And she can then click on G or R. She sees the network, but she doesn't see the choices of the non-peers. Okay. But she therefore understands that her neighbors might be making inferences on what they're seeing from their neighbors. So here's the first sort of overview slide on the findings. What we see here is the CT measure, this statistic, and we see that in all cases, you have learning, and indeed you have the most learning in terms of, if you had complete learning, you would go to 1. So you have the least learning in the stochastic block, and you have the most learning in the royal family. Okay, so that's the first sort of high-level takeaway. The second one tells us something about the convergence hypotheses. This is for simply the question here is, do you do the same thing in period t as you did in period t-1? And what we're seeing is after periods 8 onwards, you're, out of 40 people, maybe 4 people are switching, less than 4 people, maybe 3 people are switching. So you're pretty close to settling down. Here's the limiting behavior. What we see here is in the Airdraining model, you see, these are all the different rounds we ran across the groups. And you see that there's a fair bit of spread all the way from 0 to 1. In the royal family, you see a lot more learning, especially incorrect learning. And in stochastic block, you see many of the runs are close to 0. Okay, so which means that you should have, that means you are essentially around 70% of the people are choosing the right. You haven't really learned very much because you're persisting in the wrong sort of, actions. Okay, so with those findings, let me move on to hypothesis 2. The hypothesis was that you would have higher breakdown under stochastic block in the Homophilus network. And indeed, this is what you see. The blue bar is the breakdown in the Homophilus network, and it is actually larger than in the royal family and in the Airdraining. Okay. Hypothesis 3 was about greater correct and greater incorrect consensus in the royal family. And so here, the confidence intervals are overlapping, but indeed the results are in line with the hypotheses. You get more consensus, both correct and incorrect, in the royal family network. Okay. So the question is, how is it that this comes about? We actually have data also on what decisions people are making, and we can match that with what the de Groot rule would prescribe, because the de Groot rule says if at t-1, people were doing certain things, what would I do at period t? We can match that with what people did, okay, and ask how often they were consistent with the root and how often they were away from the root, okay. And so this is the final slide, final set of results. And essentially, this is telling us that, as you go towards the end of the last 4 or 5 rounds, over 85% of the decisions are consistent with the root. Okay, so indeed, people are just taking averages of their neighborhood as they make guesses. So
Great.
I think I'm out of time, right? Yeah.